Welcome, everybody. This is the wonders of technology that we are simultaneously gathering in Chicago, Milan, and Washington, D.C. Perhaps one of the innovations we might talk about and the miracle of that. But Deirdre McCloskey and Alberto Mingardi, two of my favorite economists. It's kind of shocking to me that I like an Italian economist, but on occasion that turns out okay. Can I ask first, before we get into the book, and your book is incredibly timely for the challenges we're about to face, but let me ask how you both are doing in two areas of the world where lockdowns are continuous and quite authoritarian. I'll start with you, Alberto. You've been in Milan, which was really the epicenter of the first wave. How are things right now?
Well, Milan was sort of in the center of the first wave. Happily, there's nothing happy about this, but the city in itself was not particularly hit during the first wave. It is very severely hit during the second wave. The Italian lockdown in the spring was extremely severe. Now, actually, it is slightly more bearable to the effect that, people can go for a run in the morning, certain kinds of shops are open, but people cannot move out of their city or of their town or of their region. So I think this is really giving a physical sense of how, freedom to move, which is basically the essence of freedom in many ways, can get limited. And that's a new experience. Of course, the virus is serious, particularly in some areas, including this one. But I really think we are feeling limitations to individual freedom to an extent that we never really felt them on our own skin, at least in my own lifetime.
And of course, it's the potential of the modern state which it's implementing. Now, I'm not actually in Chicago now. I moved yesterday. I came to see my mother, who is gravely ill, in Bloomington, Indiana, which is in the Eastern Time Zone. And in both states, Illinois and Indiana, you're not allowed to go to the other states. So, there's this attempt to build walls everywhere, which is part of the lack of mobility. It's very irritating that these very powerful governments that we pay for didn't do it right. The right way to do it is the way it was done in the Western Pacific. From New Zealand, Australia, Taiwan, South Korea, those are all vibrant democracies. Even Japan, but let's take those four. They all did it better because they did it quickly, once, and kept it down low enough that then they could test and trace. It's like a forest fire. There's a liberal case for the state fighting forest fires. I don't think we should leave it to the market, although there are market elements of that we could certainly use. But here we are.
Your current mayor has essentially canceled Thanksgiving, but I'm thinking actually of a previous mayor who famously said, "Never let a good crisis go to waste."
Of course, that's the fear, and I think Alberto has deeper insight into this than I do. But it can go either way. It's like Vietnam, the Vietnam War. To my generation of socialists, as I was then, or middle of the road socialists, the fact that the government couldn't do its main specialized task, which is war, competently, got through to some of us. And it started to move me away from socialism. But of course, it can go the other way. It's like an income and substitution effect in economics. People can say, "Oh yeah, well that's Bob Higgs's point about war socialism."
the way that Leviathan grows during crisis.
Yeah, that's right. It can go. You can kind of see that ideologically it can go either way.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, it tends to have Bob's ratchet into it, and I fear that this will be another one. Particularly when you have people like Mazzucato running around urging us to adopt more comprehensive economic controls.
Well, let's introduce the book, and it's fascinating and perhaps tragic that your book there's some robust marketing from Alberto, the myth of the entrepreneurial state, co-authored by the two of you and published by our friends at the American Institute for Economic Research, a lovely organization, and it strikes me that you two decided to write this book before COVID. And before anticipating this renewed call for the government to take over businesses and entrepreneurship, what was really the instigation for writing the book in the first place?
Well, I think some ideas were already in the air. And particularly, we were, very interested and worried in seeing that industrial policy, which has been out of fashion for quite a while, and for good reason in Western countries, all of a sudden came back into the public debate. An economist who's been preaching more of industrial policy everywhere in the West is Mariana Mazzucato. The name is Italian indeed, but let me stress the fact that she is educated in Anglo-Saxon countries and teaches in England. So for once, you cannot say that there is something in the Italian gene that inclines towards statism. And Professor Mazzucato is a very forceful, a very good advocate, a very good speaker of her own cause. So she wrote a book for a British think tank that was called The Entrepreneurial State, and she's been advocating more government involvement in business for the sake of producing innovation. So the essential part of her narrative is that these beautiful things that we typically tend to believe are the products of free enterprise or the markets, this cornucopia of new goods, of novelties that are coming up, that are popping up in the market every year. Actually, these novelties are there because of previous government investment. So that's her narrative, and that's a narrative which is shared by some people on the right too. I think some of our American friends watching and listening to us may remember a speech by Marco Rubio a few months ago that was advocating pretty much the same thing. With nationalism on the rise in the Trump Republican Party, many of the theorists of this Republican nationalism actually advocated some sort of industrial policy. So the idea was there, and we will see if the COVID-19 crisis is going to be the circumstance that allows this idea to take off.
Well, I would not have gotten involved in this if Alberto hadn't driven me to it. He kept saying, we got to do a little essay for the Adam Smith Society in England originally. They are the co-publishers of the book, and I kept saying, oh yeah, okay, I guess, because I didn't take her stuff seriously. I thought, God, what do you mean the government is an entrepreneur? The government, think of it on balance. And I think on balance, as an economic historian, I think it's pretty obvious that governments in the West have been obstructors of innovation. But he kept at me, and I finally caved in. We wrote this thing. it didn't take too long once we got going.
I have to say that it's always a treat to read a book by two economists that is actually written in English. And I don't say that to insult our Italian author, but very few economists know how to speak in language that actually connects with people.
Bear in mind that you introduced Alberto as an economist. He's not. He's an intellectual historian, if you want to put him in some category, of economics and of politics and of lots of other things. So maybe that's why it got so good that he wasn't an economist.
Well,
Yeah.
the reason why the book reads well is Deirdres' phenomenal prose, and I think I'm free riding on that, and I'm very pleased to.
We're all free. It's called spontaneous order, and it's also called the market, and we free ride on each other, and the trouble with this industrial policy, Mazzucato, let's get the government in on it again, is precisely that it doesn't believe in that.
So I'm old enough to remember taking a class from you, Deirdre. I'm not going to say how long ago because it would embarrass both of us, on the rhetoric of economics. And if I could boil your entire book down to a sentence, economics is about stories. And talk about that a little bit before we get into this book, because I want to rescue economics from the economists, because I feel like we as a profession do a horrible job of explaining these very important ideas that we have.
Well, that's part of the problem. As both Keynes and Hayek, I don't know who copied whom. I think Hayek copied Keynes. Both of them said in print that you can't be a good economist if you're only an economist. That's one point. And then the other point is that, it's terribly important that economic ideas get. I mean, our friend Don Boudreau is just eloquent on trying to get people to understand that protectionism is a racket, international trade protectionism. And he's, that's really the Lord's work.
So I'm reminded of the situation we're in today, where we have a real crisis, and arguably governments have done nothing but make the pandemic worse than it might have otherwise been. And it feels like the scene from one of my favorite movies, Groundhog Day. Hopefully you're both aware of.
I love that.
And I feel like Bill Murray, as someone that has argued against the follies of central planning again and again and again, and yet we wake up every morning and make the same stupid mistakes over and over again. And it's I understand the incentives of planners to plan and why governments would find expanding their own power attractive, but why does this idea that governments can be smarter than decentralized innovation, why is it so pervasive? Why does it keep coming back like a zombie apocalypse?
Alberto?
Because it's simple.
Yeah.
Because it's very simple to understand. It's very simple storytelling. It's like a mystery novel. You know who the bad guy is, the private sector.
Yeah.
You know who the good guys are, and it's a very simple narrative. It's very easy to believe that we have this beautiful smartphone because the almighty government at a certain moment in history invested in the right people or in the right technology. It's very difficult to understand that we have this wonderful smartphone, certainly because some people, some businessmen, some entrepreneurs, some scientists, some technology people were smart and creative. But also because, we had conspiring circumstances, because these people met, because one technology came out at the right time. There's a lot of chance. in our lives. And instead, when we're looking for political ideas, we want certainty. We want to know who the bad guys and who the good guys are. And, industrial policy, protectionism, all of these ideas serve that purpose beautifully.
And it's a deep problem in journalism generally. Not that, we should batter on the journalists and say they're terrible. They're not. But they do, as Alberto is saying, have this very simple guilt quest or prosecutorial line. And it irritates them when you say, well, it's just spontaneous order. It just happened. And so there's no one to blame. It just drives them nuts.
So this book is really designed as a response to Mazzucato's, nice marketing there, the Italian economist who Alberto blames the UK for, apparently, and this idea of the entrepreneurial state. But your book, you could do a global replace and replace whoever Joe Biden's primary economic advisor is. You could drop in Robert Reich. You could drop in any number of American Keynesians. And it strikes me that we are, in a lot of ways, in the United States, on the same exact path that Italy is on. We have the presumed incoming president, Joe Biden, has promised to double down on using the so-called Defense Production Act, which Trump took advantage of in what I thought was a spectacularly silly idea of forcing General Motors to make hospital equipment. And I don't know how that turned out, but I'm fairly confident that the manufacturers of that equipment could have just as easily ramped up production in a more efficient way. But he's given this potent weapon to the new president, and he seems to want to double down. He actually talks about Logan. What's the word? The supply commander.
Yes.
He's creating a position called supply commander, and that's statism is one. Yeah, statism is one word for that. But I noticed that neither of you had the audacity to use the F word in this book. When I was a young economist, I was taught that fascism was government control of the means of production. Now, I agree with George Orwell that the word has been completely rendered meaningless by all sorts of abuses of the term, but aren't we talking about government control of the means of production, even in the United States?
Yeah, sure. I mean, Italian fascism, to the extent that it had a theory at all, it was more theoretical than our current fascist president is, but it was indeed what we call the United States associative capitalism. That is, we're going to get each industry organized, and by that means they meant form a cartel, so that the steel manufacturers and the auto manufacturers and the doctors and everyone have their own little syndicalist plan to share the spoils of hurting the consumers with the trade unions, which is what the agreement was. And that's it's not Lenin, but it has some of the same effects as Lenin. So I'm perfectly willing to use the word fascism carefully. There was a really good article, I forget where it was, maybe in the Washington Post, where this historian of fascism went through the question, is Donald Trump a fascist? And he had done it before Trump was elected, and then he did it a couple of months ago after our actual experience with him. And he said, well, no, he's not a fascist yet. He's a wannabe fascist. Every instinct he has is authoritarian and indeed centralizing. He reckons the United States is a family firm, his family firm. So I agree with you that we're going to get the Bob Reich view of the world with Joe, but we can't have another 4 years of Trump. I mean, boy, they.
So what exactly is the difference between the nationalism of Trump and the sort of statism of Mazzucato and the Italian government?
Well, I think the Italian government is pretty nationalist too. So we do use nationalism as, of course, a reason to protect Italian firms, for example, to pass laws that make more difficult for a foreign investor to do something which is so atrocious and dangerous, which is bringing capital into our own country. At the end of the day, I think, one thing that we just touched upon in the book, but I consider it of increasing importance, particularly these days, and particularly when you consider, for example, the rhetoric of so-called stakeholder capitalism, is the sort of partnership which is forged between corporate leaders and the government. So, nationalism, industrial policy, stakeholder capitalism, all of these are basically nice words that are used to cover up some kind of legal privileges that some corporate leaders are effectively getting out of government. We are in a moment in which shareholders are very unpopular. But, the fact that shareholders are unpopular means that managers actually are not constrained by the discipline which is forced upon them by the fact they need to, get back to the owners of a firm, to the shareholders. I think this is really a partnership between some corporate leaders that wants to be freer in pursuing their goal and want nice excuses, and government itself. These nice excuses may sound right-wing, national, whatever, or they may sound left-wing, a more compassionate, environmental kind of capitalism. But at the end of the day, they're nice excuses to allow managers to be on the driving, as they like to say, capitalism in a direction other than the one consumer prefer every day by their purchases and by their choices.
Well, and as you said, Matt, this is not new. It's something like 100 years old. Last month, a former colleague of mine, a great historian, he spent his career at the University of Iowa and was well known as a historian, Ellis Hawley, died. And back in the 1960s, Ellis wrote a great book called The New Deal and the Problem of Monopoly. And in the New Deal, that was the deal. We'll give you it was the NRA was the problem there. But he pointed out, and then did a lot of work on it, that this idea emerged in quite mature form in the 1920s, in the form of corporatism, or in the extreme violent form of fascism, or indeed after the 1917, the experiment in communism, state socialism, my left wing. No, what's it called? They call it corporate socialism or some damn thing. They've got some excuse for the Soviet Union, my left wing friends do. But in any case, as you say, I don't know, we have to drive a silver stake through the heart of this idea at the crossroads at midnight. And Alberto and I are trying to do it, and we see this stuff is so irritatingly bad economics, bad history, and worse politics.
You know, the irony is that the call for government intervention in a time of crisis is always that sort of corporatism or cronyism, or I like to talk about the collusion of big government and big business to their mutual ends at the expense of the rest of us. But isn't that part of the reputational crisis that the word capitalism has, is that when young people think of capitalism, they're rejecting corporatism, and it seems like it's a trap.
I want to get rid of the damn word, which we all know was coined by our enemies.
Yeah.
Not actually by, as people always point out, not by Marx himself, but by his followers, capitalismus. And it's a stupid word, and it misleads people all the time. As an economic historian, many of my colleagues are absolutely convinced that capital accumulation is what causes innovation. Now, if that were true, then Mingardi would not Mingardi, he would go, curse me, what a terrible thing to say. Mazzucato would be correct, that the government could just pour money into I don't know what, and innovation would spring from it. But innovation is caused by innovation. It's caused by human beings having creative ideas. And that comes, Alberto and I think, from liberalism, from a free society, not from, I or delta K or some silly thing like that. It's not that you can't, that the capital is useless. It's necessary, but so is sunlight necessary. So is the arrow of time. So is the labor force. I mean, as we say in the book, there are all these necessary conditions that people always point to, and that's very nice. Except that the sufficient condition is human creativity. And the encouragement, the massive encouragement that liberalism gave to it, especially in the 19th century.
And this innovation ought to be market tested, because another problem with the fallacy is that, it is certainly true that if you keep pouring money to all kind of research programs in the world, then something will come out of that. Yeah, for sure. I mean, if you just go on forever financing anything, one day something useful will come out of it. Of course, we live in a world of scarce resources, and we need to cope with that fact.
She actually says that the Anglo-French Concorde, which was clearly a commercial disaster, was a good thing. She's a defender of it because the phrase she used, Alberto, I can't quite remember it, but it made things happen. There's some kind of, okay. You mean it caused things, and it meant that if you start a world war or shoot people randomly, that causes things to happen. And that was her justification. She was a graduate of the New School for Social Research in New York. And I have lots of friends there. And I've been trying for 30 years to get them to hire me. And they never got around to it because they had to hire another Marxist. And I get it. Marxist economics is under assault in the United States. It's very hard to get a job. Okay. But if I had been there, I would have taught them microeconomics. And then she wouldn't be saying these stupid things. I would have been teaching her.
So let's talk about, and Deirdre, you've written extensively on this. You have a 3-volume series on bourgeois virtues and the values that allowed for bottom-up innovation to fundamentally change the world. We have to keep telling that story because I don't think anyone is convinced that the sort of lavish wealth that we all enjoy today came from somewhere. It was just always there.
Yeah. Well, that's their one mistake, as Alberto and I just harp on it all the time. We're talking about a 3,000% increase in the ability to buy goods and services of the poorest among us. That's what this last 2 centuries of success for liberalism has caused. But you know, I say I'm against the word capitalism. I think we need a new word, innovism, to say what actually to characterize the unusual behavior of the last couple of centuries. There's a great book by the late Hans Rosling, which everyone should read too. Ours first, but then Hans, which is called Factfulness, and that first. But Factfulness is a very good book because he points out that people don't realize that this innovism has been so enriching. They just don't realize. They don't believe it. You say, things have improved since 1800. And they say, oh yeah, income has doubled or tripled. And then I say to them, time out, no, it hasn't doubled or tripled. It's gone up by a factor of 30, which is transformative. And the idea that this is the government, I think one of the problems is that at the same time this was happening, not quite the same time, after 1914, governments got much bigger, and especially after 1933. And then especially after 1945, for that matter. They got bigger and bigger and bigger. And so people came to think of the government as the source of their income, post hoc ergo propter hoc. And it wasn't. As Alberto emphasizes all the time, there are these millions of creative acts by individuals that result in improvements in common bricks, or better. Look around your room, better plastic. I'm looking out the window of my sister's house, and there's a piece of plate glass which is a door. Now, when was it possible for the first time to use plate glass as a door? Well, it's within the last century. I haven't been able to quite tie it down. But you couldn't build, and it's got nothing to do with our friends in the government.
Alberto, but the government created the internet. Surely that's pure genius, isn't it?
Well, that's one of the examples that Mariana Mazzucato examines, and her strategy when it comes to arguing her case is typically looking at the US and looking at the internet, looking at the iPhone, and claiming that these wonderful things are the result of government intervention. Now, of course, when it comes to a complex technology like the internet, with a government that has been spending, in a bigger and bigger way with time, and that for quite a while was quite interested in financing military technology. Yes, of course. Some of this investment becomes sort of building blocks that later on are used to develop other technology. But it's clearly not that the government has envisioned the internet as it is now. When ARPANET was developed, nobody had an idea of what was later to become of it, and nobody clearly thought about the commercial internet we are enjoying these days. Tom Hazlett, our friend Tom Hazlett, for example, has written extensively on this matter. I think it's very important, as Deirdre always reminds us, never to think in a rather in a rather simple way that, something was essential or is essential. I mean, at the end of the day, the economy is a game of substitution every day. Every day, entrepreneurs are thinking about how they should substitute, change one factor of production with the other if they want to, keep going with what it is for them, the best possible mixing of these factors of production. So, it's very easy to see something and say, well, sometimes in the past, the government did something good in that realm, and therefore we need to thank the White House for that. And of course, Jeff Bezos is driving on government-owned highways, but I think nobody in her sane mind will think that we need to thank the United States government for Amazon. I think, on this is actually an attitude which is rooted on what Deirdre was in what Deirdre was saying before. The fact that we are very forgetful of our past, that we don't realize the extent to which our lives improved, and we are somehow like spoiled children. We just think, we are so used to this progress that we believe that nothing can stop it. And actually, we can take it for granted and drive it in the direction we want. Instead, it's a very fragile thing.
Yeah, driving is one of the favorite words of a statist. You drive the economy as though it was a herd of sheep.
Yeah.
And of course, they have the idea of the car. I remember as a young economist back in the 1960s, we all thought we could go down to Washington and fine-tune the economy. And this was madness.
Yeah. It reminds me of, and getting back to the Groundhog Day analogy, we're basically having the exact same argument today that Frederick Hayek had with John Maynard Keynes and later the socialists. And he eventually, as you both know, he eventually took a step back and said, I think we're speaking a different language here. And he tried to explain to his central planner friends that there's this process, this bottom-up process where millions of people with unique knowledge are every day innovating to work their way out of an unknowable and uncertain future. And it gets back to that. I think we have a hard time explaining the really amazing things that happen when people are just left free to figure stuff out.
Yeah. Well, we speak of history in the book, but we also speak of economic theory. And in the course of writing the book, I got a lot clearer about a deep criticism that can be made of supply chain thinking. We have a supply chain, and we know how to make ice cream because you get the milk here and the sugar there and blah, blah, blah. And the input-output analysis, which I was a big enthusiast about when I was a student back in the 60s, is another example. But so is the so-called, it's a bad word for it, but I call it Samuelsonian economics, the idea of the production function, which, as Alberto was saying, is in its sort of good form, is just saying, well, there are substitutes. But in its bad form, it says we already know what the substitutes are. And then it becomes a little machine. And then it's easy to drive the economy. Because we know what the inputs are, the outputs, just push it. And it's, I've become in the last 20 years or so much more an Austrian economist. Where, I finally read Hayek, dope that I was, and Mises, and lots of other people. Don Lavoie was important in leading me to it. And I think the Austrians have got it more or less right, that the core of a innovistic economy is what they call, in their own jargon, human action. Human action is just a not very attractive word for creativity. As you just said, Matt, facing a very uncertain opportunity for substitution or for getting a new thing. And incidentally, by the way, something we also mentioned in the book is that consumers have an input here. Not just that they buy the stuff at the grocery store, but that they think of new uses for it. The way the teenagers learned to use what was once a lineman's code in the phone company to send messages. That's the consumers making up new uses. So there's all this creativity going on, which is ignored by the masterful central planners who keep on thinking that they know better than, well, actually billions of other people.
I'm fascinated that your intellectual foe actually is trying to co-opt the word entrepreneurship, because in the United States, of course, capitalism is not popular. Capitalism is a word with so much baggage. But young people that imagine themselves as democratic socialists very much believe in entrepreneurship. They love innovation. They love this bottom-up, community-based process of solving problems. So to me, it's like I could be depressed about that, but I feel like there's an opportunity here. But we have to sort of reclaim our word. They've already taken all our other words. We need entrepreneur back. How do we do that, Alberto?
Well, I agree with that. And clearly, the problem here is that these young people see lots of novelties, fancy things, and they just come to think, that the bureaucracy could work the same.
Yeah.
And of course, it cannot, because incentives are different, because the way in which it works is different, because it's a system which is not based upon the price mechanism. So it's very bad to, get hold of this information and this knowledge that are dispersed in the economy. But once again, it's very easy for people to empathize, to think, well, we do have Apple. Why can't we have an Apple government or an Amazon government? Why can't we have government running like that? Yeah. And I think it's a very serious question for us. Also, that there is something which is deep-rooted in all individuals, which is this instinct to meddle with other people's life. And these attitudes grows on that, this idea that we can actually tell our fellow man what is better for him because of whatever criteria. I think, what we need to do, and particularly, in this sort of intellectual action people like you, Matt, are undertaking every day, is perhaps going back to examples, to stories. And, the world of entrepreneurship is giving us plenty of wonderful stories. And we don't really know the world in which we live. Yeah. This applies to this youngster on the left, but to us too. I mean, when we're using this technology, we are seldom aware actually of the history of its own components, of the way in which it was developed, and the same is true for a whole variety of things. Let me just give you just one example: the food industry in the COVID-19 crisis. Every expert in March and April thought that the food industry was about to melt down because clearly, the production of food, particularly in the US, but also in Europe, was targeted, was directed, was driven by and large towards restaurants. And then overnight consumption the use of this material by restaurants collapsed. And instead, people needed to go to the grocery and buy stuff for making their own food. And of course, it's not the same to produce mozzarella for pizzerias and produce mozzarellas for families. It's a totally different thing. You do it in different ways. It's amazing how the food industry adapted basically overnight. Of course, I'm sure that plenty of businesses failed. I'm sure you got some natural selection going on, but it's a wonderful story. And I think these are the sort of things that we need to focus on in order to give real life example of how amazingly creative and adaptive and inspiring the world of business can be.
But there are two ways that humans think: storytelling, narrative, on the one hand, and metaphor, analogy, comparison on the other. That thing that I've just said has been confirmed by brain science very deeply. So it's not just stories. If you say stories, if you don't understand that's part of it, that's the narrative part, and that's right. But there's also an analogy. We can also use analogies to get through to people, or metaphors. And one is that would the kids, now we're talking to the young people now. The old people are hopeless. They're not ever going to change. Bob Reich is not ever going to understand markets. He refuses to. We can say to them, what, would you like government planning a la Mazzucato of rock music? Do you think that's a good idea? Or of painting? Or of style, clothing style? You think that would be a good idea? I mean, if it's good for this part of our society, why not for that? Would you think that dating should be centralized and planned by Mariana Mazzucato, who, after all, knows better than you what sort of a boyfriend you should have? Well, as they say in Italy, this is pazzo, and it is. It's completely local. It's insane. And I think they would, I think country music, rock music, and then in an older vein, jazz, embody liberty.
Absolutely. They're speaking of metaphors. I want to wrap up on rescuing some of the language that used to be ours, including the word liberal, but the metaphor, which I'm guessing came from you, Deirdre, and perhaps borrowed from some of your colleagues, of the market as a radically democratic conversation, where everybody's, and Hayek, I used to call Hayek, summarize Hayek as sort of an unspoken dialogue that how people coordinate their activities, but it strikes me that we are the Democrats because we believe that everybody should have a voice, and we believe that everybody's choices should be empowered, and not the vulgar democracy where 50 plus 1 get to tell the other 49% of the world what to do. But I love that metaphor of that this is a conversation, and why it has to be free is that the conversations don't work from the top down. They are, by definition, something that happens from the bottom up.
Yeah, and this was forced on me. I'm a very slow thinker. By my dear friend, the Dutch economist Ariel Klammer, who right from the beginning of his academic career has spoken of economics and then the economy, which took me decades to make that move as a conversation. But there's a great sociologist, Howard Becker, speaks in exactly the same way. He speaks of worlds, and if you read Howie's description of this, it's ours. It's ours of a liberal conversation, and in particular, it's against a whole other sociological approach, which is top-down coercion, power, prestige, That's how the society works. Whereas actually, I think the society, as in the case of rock music or fashion, works with millions of people interacting in a world, as Howard says.
So statism versus innovism is really a question of coercion versus conversation.
Exactly.
I think we need to run with that because I think it's a very persuasive way for people to wrap their hands around this mysterious thing where suddenly there's food on my table every night and I can't figure out exactly how it happened. But this is another way of saying this is statism versus liberalism. And as both of you know, the word liberal in the United States does not mean what you mean. How do we get our word back?
How about it, Alberto? I mean, it's even more paradoxical in Italy because every sentient Italian knows that lo Stato is corrupt, stupid, coercive, and clumsy. They all know it. Yet they don't vote for liberals. Perché?
Actually.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know if even if they wanted to vote for liberals, at least in recent elections, they had no liberal option. So their vote could not be expressed in that way. I think I think it was Schumpeter saying that the enemies of free enterprise picked up the word liberal in a sort of homage to their own enemies. And to the success of the free enterprise system. We have a very good friend, Professor Dan Klein, who's doing whatever he can to regain liberalism to its true meaning. I love Dan. I don't think he's going to be successful in this particular endeavor because at the end of the day, in a spontaneous order, such as the language is, it is the people who decide how words are used. Clearly, classical liberalism doesn't sound particularly well, but I think one important thing, perhaps for us all, is it's not so much to reclaim the word liberalism, but to reclaim the word liberty. Because liberty was used as a flag for all sorts of political experiments in the past. And I think that a concept that to most of us is instinctive, is clear, like the concept of liberty. Don't have somebody, stealing your stuff and outing you. That concept is not clearly associated with liberty by many in the United States, in Italy, in Europe, and in other places too. I think we are the liberty movement somehow, and we should make that clearer.
Well, you, Matt, have done your part with your wonderful book. How's it go?
Don't hurt people and don't take their stuff.
That's right. And Art Carden and I have just published a book of the same character, summarizing my trilogy, and its main title is "Leave Me Alone and I'll Make You Rich."
Yeah.
I mean, again, we have to, as you say, it's like it's some sort. As you say, it's very like Groundhog Day. We're making these arguments over and over and over again, and then we wake up at 6 a.m. to the same news program.
Yeah. So let's, Deirdre, we're going to let you go here in just a second. And before we do, I want Alberto to shamelessly promote your new book and tell people where we can get a copy of this very readable and compact critique of all of the statist planners that are trying to ruin our lives right now.
Well, just go to your favorite online store. It's an Amazon. This is actually, it's not expensive at all. It makes for great Christmas presents. Your niece, your sons, your mother may want that. So Think about it. This is gonna be making you looking so good at Christmas with your family.
So I know what to get my wife Terry for Christmas, and if she's displeased in any way, I'll send her to both of you.
Blame me. She won't be displeased anyway. I mean, really, it's certain. Can you really think of a better Christmas present?
Well, and it's short too. It's short.
Deirdre, how do we find? You've written so many things that I think are essential for understanding and communicating liberty. How can people find out more about your work?
Well, the easiest way is to go to my very good website, which I have nothing to do with making or maintaining, called DeirdreMcCloskey.org. You have to spell Deirdre correctly, Deirdre, and McCloskey too. But you know, if you're an Italian speaker, go to the Alberto's Istituto in Milan. Go to the American Institute for Economic Research. They do good stuff, and Cato does good stuff, and Adam Smith. You know, these days, these ideas are really easy to access. Whereas when I was growing up, there was this kind of narrow window of published books. And for example, when I was a kid, we had to read in school, and not in school so much, in college, lots of Marx. So I know more about Marx than most ordinary Marxists do. But that's not, and I believed it for a while, but that what was assigned in university courses. Unfortunately, that's still happening. But the kids can get around it rather easily.
They can find your book, and I'm gonna propose that 12 months from now we commit to gathering in Milan to drink legally drink Barolo together in person, in hopes that we are free again. Thank you both so much.
That's a wonderful idea. Let's do that.
Ciao, bambini.
Thanks for watching Kibbe on Liberty. By now, you know this is the most important event of your week. So make sure you subscribe on YouTube. Click the little bell so you get notifications. Kibbe on Liberty, mostly honest conversations with mostly interesting people.